Doug, if I could ask you to open in a word of prayer.
Yeah, sure. Father in heaven, we just thank you for yesterday, all the activities you allowed us to do for your glory and for just the fellowship that we have with one another. We just praise you for that. We praise you now for the fellowship we have with you and one another as we worship you on this day. And we pray you be with Lauren as he brings forth the study in Judges and Samson, Lord. We just pray our mind and hearts are open to not only hear it and understand it, but apply it to our lives for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to be in Judges chapter 15 today, the third chapter for Samson. 2 weeks ago in Judges 13, we saw the beginnings of Samson and how that, as we've seen with all of the other judges, Israel has sinned, turned away from God, and are being oppressed, this time by the Philistines. And God raises up, in this case, a judge or deliverer, Samson, from birth, which is unique. None of the other judges were called from birth. And really the call comes to Samson's parents from an angel. But the other thing that's unique about Samson here is that Israel at this point is not crying out to God for deliverer. They've sinned, they're being oppressed by the Philistines, but they are not crying out for help. They're not crying out to God, and unlike the account with Jephthah, they're not even really crying out to a human deliverer. With the account of Jephthah, Jephthah was called by one of the tribes of Israel, originally not by God. So here, the Israelites have hit a point where they are not crying out to God for deliverer. They are not crying out to a human entity for deliverance. They are not crying out for deliverance at all. And that comes into play in chapter 15 today. Chapter 14, we have the wedding last week of Samson, where he chases after a woman that God had said, no, you should be marrying within the tribe of Israel. You should be marrying a child of God, a believer, and he's chasing after this Philistine woman. Interestingly, with chapter 14, it starts with him requesting his father go and get him his bride. Chapter 15 starts with Samson going to his father-in-law to request access to his bride. Both chapters start with Samson going to a father pursuing this Philistine woman. And in chapter 14, his father says, no, isn't there some woman from Israel that you could go after, rather than this Philistine woman that you shouldn't be going after? And Samson insists. Chapter 15, it's kind of interesting. Samson's father-in-law, ironically, does more to deter Samson from this wrong marriage than Samson's father himself. And so the wedding in chapter 14, Samson kind of ruins it with this foolish wager that he makes with 30 other individuals who are brought in to be his companions for this wedding, and ends up with him getting angry, going and killing 30 Philistines, taking and robbing their clothing, giving it as what he's lost in this wager, and then he abandons his wife completely, storms off to his parents. So a little bit of geography as far as where we're at right now. Let's see. Wedding was in Timnah, which is a Philistine city. Samson grew up in Zorah, so he's gone back to his father's house in Zorah. Another spot that will show up later in this passage that I'll point out is Lehi, is an important location. And the Rock of Etam, which is not really a city, it's probably a cave or rocky area very close to Lehi that Samson flees to in this passage. So that's kind of where we are geographically. So I want to go over kind of an overview of the structure of this passage, and then we'll get into the details of it. So first part of the chapter, verses 1 to 2, Samson completely loses his Philistine wife. In end of 14, he's abandoned her. Here he tries to reclaim her, and he finds he's lost his wife. Because of that, he uses foxes and fire for revenge against the Philistines. The Philistines then use fire as revenge against him. And then Samson gets revenge against the Philistines again. At this point, the Philistines want to put a stop to Samson, and they appeal to Judah, the tribe of Judah, to help them arrest Samson. And sadly, Judah helps them to arrest Samson. And the Philistines want to do this because, of course, they want to get revenge on what Samson has done to them. As a result of this, God then wields Samson almost as a weapon or as a tool to kill a heap of Philistines, kind of one of the biggest victories Samson has. Talk about why I've termed it that way later on. And then chapter 15 ends with God graciously giving Samson water. Throughout this, the first part, up until very close to the end when God gets involved, is this back and forth revenge between Samson and the Philistines. Of them constantly, well, you did this to me, so I'm going to do this to you. Samson and the Philistines' motivation throughout this entire chapter is exactly the same. They are both motivated by pride and selfish revenge. So let's take a look at the details of that. Kind of wanted to go over that as far as what the overall view of the chapter was and how that this motivation of both Samson and the Philistines is very much a motivation of revenge. And two questions that we'll be looking at that really been kind of the two framing questions that all the way back to the beginning of this study as far as what does the passage in Judges tell us about God and what is wrong with this picture. Because each one of these judges, each one of these narratives we've seen, there is something wrong about them. And very much the narrative of Samson, there are just so many things wrong with it. So we'll start in chapter 15, verse 1. So after a while, in the time of wheat harvest, it happened that Samson visited his wife with a young goat. You know, nothing says romance than taking a young goat to the wife. Though actually, this was evidently a tradition. This was evidently part of the culture. We're not going to turn there, but Judah, and not the tribe of Judah here, but the person Judah, in Genesis 38, offers Tamar a young goat as a gift. Now, in that account, and we're not going to turn there, but it is somewhat related to this account, in that both of them are very much accounts that fall in the category of what's wrong with this picture. Both of them are involving individuals, here Samson, and in Genesis 38, Judah, who should be godly men who God has chosen, who are going in a very wrong direction. And in both cases, it's a wrong direction in terms of marital fidelity and who they should have a proper marital relationship with. In Genesis 38, the reason Judah is giving Tamar a young goat as a gift, is because Tamar had married Judah's oldest son. Judah's oldest son had done evil and was killed by God. So under the Levirate laws, so that Judah would have a lineage to his eldest son, his second oldest son would be given to Tamar, and their descendants would be counted through Judah and his oldest son. Well, Judah's second son does evil and is also killed by God. So now it would go to Judah's third son. And Judah likely here is thinking, well, this is not going well. My first two sons have died after marrying Tamar. Now he's doing the math wrong here. It's not because they married Tamar, it's because of the evil that they did. And so he talks to Tamar. He's like, no, you have to wait. My third son, he's not old enough yet. Go away and wait. Well, she later finds out that the third son has become old enough, and she hasn't been approached because Judah is trying to kind of get out of this. So she comes up with a plan, which really wasn't much better than what Judah and his sons were doing, and that is she dresses up as a prostitute and stays on very close on the road to Timnah. That's the other tie-in here. Both of these events occurred very close to the city of Timnah. And Judah comes along, he sees her, and he propositions her. And basically he promises her a young goat if she will sleep with him as a prostitute. Now he doesn't happen to have a goat with him, and so he gives her some proof that he's going to pay, a seal and a staff and that sort of thing, which he keeps. She ends up getting pregnant and comes back, and Judah is initially like, oh, whoever did this should be punished and killed and that sort of thing. And then he finds out it was him. And he recognizes that this was because he withheld his son from Tamar. And so it's really kind of this awful story of this unfaithfulness in the roots of Judah because of not being right in marriage. Judah should have never have withheld his son, but additionally, he should have never been going after a prostitute to begin with, regardless of whether it was Tamar or any other woman that wasn't his wife. Well, Samson here is bringing a young goat to consummate a marriage to a woman, this Philistine woman, that he should never have had a relationship with in Timnah. So I think those details are put in here so that the reader of Judges thinks back to the account of Judah as a reminder. And the tribe of Judah also shows up in this passage. So it kind of ties in there with that. And so Samson brings this young goat as a gift, and he says, let me go into my wife, into her room. And so here it's very likely that when his wager went south and he got angry at the wedding and stormed off, that as was the custom in that day, he had not consummated his wedding, which would have occurred during kind of that wedding feast period. And so because he hadn't consummated the wedding, he's now coming back with this goat as a gift to seal the deal, so to speak, and consummate the wedding and collect his bride. The problem is, her father would not permit him to go in, and her father says in verse 2, I really thought that you thoroughly hated her. Therefore, I gave her to your companion. So here, when he sees Samson is abandoned, he's thinking, all right, he's not coming back. And so the best man would step in. And there would be nothing wrong with this because at this point, the marriage had not been consummated. This really isn't Samson's wife at this point, even though he's claiming her as his wife. And so the father-in-law gives him away. And so now the father-in-law being confronted with Samson and the goat gift and such, kind of feels a little bit guilty, has to do something, because it's very likely Samson has paid a bride price to the father-in-law, and he probably doesn't want to refund this. And so he goes on to offer, is not her younger sister better than she? Please take her instead. So the father's like, well, the woman who you paid for the bride price, she's married, you can't have her. But here, her younger sister, she's very attractive, why don't you take her? Very likely to try to appease Samson because he probably had paid a bride price, which would have been tradition at that point. And kind of a comment on that as far as the bride price, especially in Israelite culture. Often we look back at that and think of that as this, treating the woman as property and buying her. That wasn't at all what the tradition was. The bride price was, this is a nomadic culture. This is a nomadic culture that doesn't have instant messaging and cell phones and Facebooking and that sort of thing. Doesn't even have reliable mail service. And so you have an individual, a man who comes to proposition a daughter and marry her, very likely he's going to take her back to his family's household. That may be some journey away. The bride's family may not see her for months or even years. So they want to have an assurance that this man who is courting their daughter has the financial standing, the responsibility to be able to care for her. And the proof of that was that the man would be able to pay sometimes equivalent to 1 year's wages as the bride price. That was not purchasing the woman as property. That was an assurance to the family that this individual was an individual who had a job, who could put money into savings, and was somebody who could take care of their daughter financially. This was an assurance of the individual's character more than it was a transaction of property. Or that's what it was supposed to be. So at this point, in reality, Samson's father-in-law has in a strange way done what Samson's father should have done. And basically telling him, you can't marry this Philistine woman. This is actually, in some ways, a father-in-law acting graciously towards Samson and avoiding what he shouldn't have been doing. He shouldn't have been marrying her. But Samson's response is not to recognize, this was a mistake that I shouldn't have been making to begin with. I should write off the bride price as a learning here and go back and find an appropriate bride. But he doesn't. Instead, he says to them in verse 3, this time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them. His response is one of revenge. His pride has been hurt. The woman that he saw, the woman that he insisted his parents get, the woman that he wanted, the woman that he even abandoned, when he comes back, he's thinking, why would she have been given away? This is mine. He's very self-centered. And so now he seeks revenge. His motivation is completely revenge because of his pride. And it's interesting that he says, this time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them. He's already harmed the Philistines once, in that he went and killed 30 individuals in Ashkelon and stole their clothing. Even here, I think he recognizes that his actions there weren't entirely right. That he had lost the wager fair and square, and his response was to be a sore loser and go kill 30 people who had nothing to do with the wager at all. Weren't even in the same city as the wedding was and knew nothing about it. But he just didn't want to get the money out of pocket for the 30 garments he owed. So here I think he even recognizes the first time he was probably a little bit blameful. Where here he's like, this time I'll be blameless because they've done wrong to me. They've taken this woman away from me who I abandoned. But it's interesting. His revenge here, he doesn't go after his father-in-law. He doesn't go after the family. He goes after the Philistines in a more broader sense. And he goes out in verse 4. He caught 300 foxes. He took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, put a torch between each pair of tails, and when he set the torches on fire, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and burned up both the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and the olive groves. So this has really escalated here. He's gone from losing a wager and killing 30 to losing a woman as a wife that he should never have taken as a wife before, who he actually abandoned and why he's lost her, to torching the harvest. So this is at harvest time, so the grain is ready to be harvested, and goes through and torches it. The number of people will be impacted with this, not just the Philistine soldiers, but women and children who are not going to have food because of his actions. And it's because he's lost something. Now, the flip side, though, despite this being an act of revenge of Samson, despite him going and killing the 30 as being an act of revenge, Samson is being used of God here. Even though Samson's motivations are wrong, Samson here is being used to begin to deliver the Israelites from their oppressors, the Philistines, by attacking the Philistines. And here, he's attacking grain. The Philistines' god Dagon was the god of grain. He was the one who brought them prosperity through the grain and through the harvest, or so they believed. So here, on one level, this is Samson's horrible act of revenge. It's kind of cruel to the foxes when you think about it. There's probably other ways he could have lit fire without going after the foxes. But on the other hand, God is still using this aimed at dismantling Philistine culture by attacking their god, their false god Dagon, through the grain and the crops. So something that is kind of a paradox with Samson is Samson is both this individual, is prideful and selfish and driven by revenge, but at the same time he was chosen by God to begin the deliverance of the Israelites from the Philistines. And despite Samson going wrong, it does not deter God from his plan. So one of the themes of Samson is unworthy humans are not going to derail God's plan. Even though what Samson is doing is motivated by revenge, he is unwittingly being used as a tool and an agent of God here against the Philistines. So verse 6, of course the Philistines respond and say, "Who has done this?" And very quickly the answer is Samson. And it's interesting here, Samson is not referred to here as Samson the Danite, the Israelite from the tribe of Dan. He's not referred to as Samson, Manoah's son. He is referred to as Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite. Now, he's really not the son-in-law of the Timnite because he abandoned the woman he was going to marry, but he still considered that. And I think this is an interesting reference here because Samson here is not being referred to as a Danite. He's not being referred to as this Israeli troublemaker, in this case by the Philistines. He's being identified as being Samson, the son-in-law of a Philistine. Even whoever said this recognized that Samson was more Philistine than Israelite. Which is sad because that wasn't what he was supposed to be. He was supposed to be a Nazirite from birth. He was supposed to be an individual who was going to be this deliverer, and yet he's unrecognizable from the culture that is oppressing Israel, the Philistines. So Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnites, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion. So they point out that Samson has attacked the crops because the Timnite, his father-in-law, has taken away his wife from him. So here the Philistines seek revenge, but it's interesting, it's just like Samson, they're not seeking revenge, they're not seeking justice on the one who actually burdened the fields, Samson. They're going after the father-in-law. So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. They decide not to go after Samson. They go after the Timnite, the Philistine, and his wife. And his daughters. We actually saw her and her family be threatened with fire during the wedding. The 30 companions, when they couldn't figure out Samson's wager, they went and said, "You find this out from Samson. You find out the answer to this because we don't want to lose this wager to him, or we will burn your house with fire." And so she does it. And her reward here is she and her family are still burned with fire. So he kills them, goes in hiding in the rock of Etam. So the Philistines went up, encamped in Judah, and deployed themselves against Lehi. The word Lehi is the same Hebrew word for jawbone. And the man of Judah said, "Why have you come against us?" And so they answered, "We have come up to arrest Samson, to do to him as he has done to us." That's pretty much the refrain and the motivation of both the Philistines and Samson here. To do to him as he has done to us. In verse 7, Samson said, "Since you do a thing like this, I will surely do a thing like that to you." Both the Philistines and Samson are basically saying the same thing. Their motivation is the same. Samson is more Philistine than Israelite here. This is also kind of sad here because the Philistines come up against the tribe of Judah. And Judah's like, "Why are you coming up against us?" And they respond, "Well, we've come to arrest Samson, to do to him as he had done to us." The numbers haven't been divulged here yet, but in the passage we're going to see there are 1,000 Philistines who've come up to get Samson. There are at least 3,000 Judites. Judah has a 3-to-1 advantage here. But they end up being the one who buckle and capitulate to the Philistines, rather than taking up arms against the Philistines. In verse 11, we see, "Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, 'Do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? What is this you have done to us?'" This is a big clue as to why so far in this account no one from Israel is crying out to God for deliverance. They're not interested in being delivered. They have completely accepted Philistine rule over them. They're happy with this. They're fine with this. They don't have a problem with this. What they do have a problem with is Samson being an instigator that's riling up problems between Judah and the Philistines. Their problem is not that they're being oppressed by this pagan nation, the Philistines. They're good with that. That's fine. Samson was likely attracted to the city of Timnah because the Philistine culture was a much more vibrant culture than the Israelite culture, a much more sophisticated culture. They had art, they had, established cities and such. It's very likely that at this point, the reason we do not see the Israelites calling out for a deliverer is they see no need for one because they are completely happy in the condition they're in. They become so Canaanized, they've become so much in the culture that at this point, they're turning against the one that God rose up to be their deliverer, despite the fact that his approach isn't the best, and despite the fact that Samson has his problems, they're still turning on the one who's going to begin to deliver them. We've seen in some earlier passages a little bit of that in the Ephraimites turning against Gideon, but Gideon appeals to them with diplomacy and talks them down from this. We then have the Ephraimites challenging Jephthah. In that case, it ended up with civil war and a horrible bloodshed. Here, we have Judah, the tribe of Judah, siding with the Philistines and going to arrest Samson to turn them over to the Philistines. Because they've gotten to the point where they're so absorbed in this culture, they're happy with this arrangement. I think this is partially why Samson, the prophecy for Samson is he will begin the deliverance. Well, part of the problem here is at this point, the sin has gotten so bad that the Israelites don't even recognize they need deliverance. they're happy with that condition. And so here, Samson's role in beginning the deliverance is more as an instigator or a stone that God is throwing into the pond, not just to go after the Philistines, but to rile up the Philistines against the Israelites, so the Israelites recognize this is not the way it should be. They should not be comfortable in Philistine culture. They should not be comfortable calling the Philistines their ruler, because their ruler should be God Jehovah, not the Philistines. But they don't recognize that here. And sadly, Samson, the deliverer, doesn't recognize it either. Because when they question him on this, as far as what is this you have done to his response is exactly the same response that the Philistines gave to Judah. As they did to me, so have I done to them. We have the Philistines coming to Judah. Judah asks them, the tribe of Judah, why are you coming against us? And the response is, we want to arrest Samson to do to him as he has done to us. They then go to Samson. They're like, why have you done this? And he responds exactly the same way to the Philistines. As they did to me, so I have done to them. Both sides of this is in the wrong. And they don't recognize it. If this had been a leader like Joshua, he would have gone to Judah, whoa, wait a minute, and reminded them of God Jehovah, reminded them of what God had done. Would have fallen on his face and torn his clothes in prayer, and would have tried to recruit Judah to be the leader they should have been. Because in the beginning of the book of Judges, when Joshua died, the tribe of Judah was picked to lead the Israelites against those who were still in the land. Here, they've fallen to the point where they're failing to do this so badly that they're not only not leading against the foreign influence, they're handing over Samson. And Samson doesn't even recognize this. He doesn't appeal to that. He doesn't say, whoa, wait a minute. There's 3,000 of you. There 3,000 Judah soldiers and plus Samson should be pretty good against 1,000 Philistines. But that's not brought up here. Instead, we have them say to Samson, we have come down to arrest you that we may deliver you into the hand of the Philistines. And Samson's response is, swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves. He doesn't care that he's being arrested and handed over to the Philistines. He just doesn't want to pick a fight with the tribe of Judah. He doesn't want them to kill him. Now, whether that's because he has some shred of decency here and realizes he is not going to fight against Judah, or if he's counted the number of soldiers and there's 3,000 of them and he's questioning, well, he did rip a lion apart and he's done some feats that God empowered him to do, but he's not entirely sure that God is going to empower him to kill 3,000 of the tribe of Judah. Whether he did the math on that, we don't know, but here his concern is just that Judah doesn't kill him. He's fine being handed over to the Philistines. And so they speak to him, nope, but we will tie you securely and deliver you into their hand, but we will surely not kill you. We're not going to kill you. We're going to give it to the Philistines, and that's probably what they're going to do to you. But no, we won't do that. Our hands are clean in this. They bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him. So the Philistines see their enemy bound and brought up, and they celebrate. And here in verse 14, as we're getting close to the end of chapter 15, is the first we see of God showing up. So far to this point, the tribe of Judah, when Philistines came against him, did not pray to God. Samson, when he lost his wife, he didn't pray to God. He has not appealed to God throughout any of this. And here, he is still not appealing to God. It is God, out of his graciousness, that in using Samson as a deliverer is not going to allow Samson's foolishness to get in the way of that plan. And the Spirit of the Lord comes mightily upon him. And the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire. Which I think is kind of an interesting description, because this chapter started with Samson burning the harvest with fire. And now the ropes are breaking as if burned with fire. And his bonds broke loose from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. He also breaks the Nazirite vow again here. Part of the Nazirite vow was not handling a dead corpse. A donkey is an unclean animal to begin with, and grabbing a donkey, and this is a fresh jawbone of donkey. This is not some dried up skeleton he's found. He is ripping it off of a fresh carcass and then wailing on the Philistines with it. And then he follows that with verse 16. And then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. He has this thing about celebrating his accomplishments with poems. With the lion, when he used it as a creative snack bar with the honey, he made a little poem out of that. That was the foolish wager that he made as his wedding. And now, after God enables him to kill these 1,000 Philistines, he makes this celebratory song with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. The focus is on him, from him. He celebrated the death of the lion with the riddle. He celebrates this with a poem. He certainly has a creative use of animals. He used the lion that he killed as kind of this buffet to get some honey. The foxes, he spread fire with them. The donkey, he makes into a weapon. Each one of these, there's something kind of wrong with them. Two of them are, well, breaking the Nazirite vow, and one of them's kind of cruel to the foxes. And I think this is kind of a clue. Something's wrong with Samson's method here. And his poem really highlights that, because his poem is about him slaying 1,000 men and just heaping and piling them up. And if you think about that, I mean, that's kind of a horrifying picture, but it's what it would be. You have an individual who's killing 1,000 men with this jawbone of a donkey. This is going to take the better part of a day, and the end result is just going to be these mounds and heaps around him. And instead of thanking God with humility for saving him and using him against the Philistines, his response is his accomplishment, even though it's not really his. If you think back to Deborah's song of praise, hers was very different. Deborah and Barak's song of praise turned the focus on God for the victory. Here, Samson's not doing that. And so it was, when he had finished speaking, that he threw the jawbone from his hand and called that place Ramath Lehi. Ramath Lehi would translate to Jawbone Hill. And whether it was a hilly terrain or whether he called it that because the hills or mounds of bodies. Don't know, could be either one. And then he became very thirsty, which is not surprising. You spend better part of a day fighting 1,000 Philistines with a jawbone, you're probably going to get thirsty, as there probably weren't a lot of timeouts and drink breaks and that sort of thing for him. So it makes sense. And so he cries out to the Lord. And this is kind of good, because this is like the first we've seen in this chapter of anybody crying out to the Lord at all. But then the problem is how he cries out. You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised. This sounds more like a manipulative demand than a humble prayer. He does not really thank God here. He does acknowledge you have given this great deliverance, but the way he words it, you've given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant. He's like, yeah, it's by my hand, Samson's hand. And you've done this, and now I'm going to die of thirst. I'm so thirsty. Well, first, this is actually a little bit like what his father said when they realized that they had seen the angel of God. And his father goes to his wife, surely we are going to die as we've seen the face of God, we've seen the angel of God. And his wife's like, I don't think so. The angel just promised that we're going to have a son who's going to begin to deliver the Philistines. If he was going to kill us, he probably wouldn't have done that. Well, here Samson is kind of falling into the same logic his father had, and be like, oh, all these Philistines are dead and I'm going to die of thirst. Well, no, if God had the ability, since God had the ability to have him kill 1,000 Philistines with a jawbone, which is very clearly could not have been in his strength. It doesn't matter how strong he was. 1,000 people. That's an act of God. That God's going to let him die of thirst? No. This is God wanting Samson to recognize God, thank God, and then humbly appeal to God. But Samson falls on his manipulative demand. But despite this, despite Samson's unworthiness here, God still is gracious. So God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, and water came out, and he drank, and his spirit returned, and he revived. And therefore he called his name An-Hakor, which is a spring of the caller, which is in Lehi to this day. Now there's some translations that translate Lehi here as jawbone, and I can even remember in Sunday school, like one Sunday school book where Samson was like drinking out of the jawbone. That's not the picture here. Lehi, the name of the place, means jawbone. And so if you translate the name of the place, Lehi, to jawbone, it makes it sound as if the spring's coming out of the jawbone of the donkey. It's not. It's coming out of the rocks in Lehi, the location of Lehi. It's just that here, since in the original Hebrew, the jawbone would have been referred to as Lehi, as that's a word for jawbone, and the place was Lehi. Some translations translated every spot Lehi was as jawbone, and others translated the location as Lehi and the weapon as jawbone. And then verse 20, we have, and he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. First, that's only half a generation. Othniel was 40 years. And not only was he 40 years, Israel had rest for 40 years. Ehud, rest for 80 years, 2 generations. Deborah and Barak, rest for 40 years. Gideon, rest for 40 years. But after Gideon, none of the judges make it a full generation. Tola is 23 years. Jair is 22 years. Jephthah is a mere 6 years, the smallest of them. And I think that is an indication of his character being quite bad. Ibzan, 7 years. Elon, 10 years. Abdon, 8 years. And Samson, only 20 years. The other thing that's interesting about this is here we basically have this victory of Samson, and the passage ends with, and he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. With every other judge, that was it. It ended there, and it moved on to the next judge. That's not the case here. Chapter 16, that we'll do next week, continues with Samson as his footnote where things go a little bit worse. So some key things here in this. What does this tell us about God? One, that God may use unworthy humans to accomplish his plan. Just because God uses somebody to accomplish his plan does not mean God is endorsing that person's as a righteous or godly individual. God used the Babylon Empire led by the Chaldean king of Nebuchadnezzar to destroy the southern kingdom of Israel. He used that as a tool, not that the Babylonian Chaldean Empire was godly. Incidentally, when that happened, the Philistines were also wiped out. The Israelites returned to the land of Israel after that captivity. The Philistines did not. Also, God gives grace towards unworthy humans. He gave water, the spring, to Samson when he was thirsty. And this is like a really good truth here, because when it comes right down to us, probably all of us are, well, not probably, but all humans are unworthy. And even though we may not have done some of the sins of some of these judges, it is still a good thing that God is still gracious towards us even when we fail. But it's not a reward for our failure. It's him drawing us back. And what's wrong with this picture? Samson, even though he is this tool that God is using, his motivation is for selfish revenge. Samson could have done so much more than just be a weapon that God wielded. Throughout the book of Judges, there's a lot of untraditional weapons that are used. Shamgar and his ox goad, Gideon and the clay pots and the torches and the trumpets, Jael and her hammer and her tent peg, the unnamed woman who drops a millstone on Abimelech's head. These are all kind of unconventional weapons. The jawbone of a donkey here with Samson. And I think part of that is pointing at here, Samson himself is more of an unconventional weapon that God is wielding rather than being an example of a righteous person that we should follow. And the goal should not be to just be a weapon that God is wielding against sin, but rather to have a right heart condition and then serve God out of servanthood. Samson follows victory with arrogant boast instead of humility and thankfulness and manipulative demands to God. And Samson never appeals to God for justice or deliverance for Israel. It's always about revenge. Israel themselves are not appealing to God for justice. At this point, they've hit a point where they're comfortable with this oppression and they don't even recognize that they need a deliverer. The last few weeks I ran into somewhere this interview with an evangelist, and he commented that in today's culture worldwide, he as an evangelist has recognized that he needs to shout the need for deliverance and whisper the gospel. And his point with that was, if we shout the gospel, but people don't know they need to be delivered, it's not going to mean anything to them. And so until they get to a point where they recognize they need deliverance, the gospel means nothing. And at that point, he says, you can whisper it, because they will want it so bad they will listen. And that's where Israel's with this, with Samson. God is providing a deliverer that they don't want. They need to get to the point where they are crying out for a deliverer. And that's partly how God is going to use Samson to begin the deliverance here, is to rile up and make Israel no longer comfortable in this setting so that they will then cry out for a deliverer. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for these words. Help us to cry out to you for justice, cry out for you in humility and thankfulness, that we would be close to you first and then be used by you, rather than trying to manipulate through selfish dealings. Pray also for the morning service and those working with the kids down the hall, that the day would be blessed to you. In Jesus' name, amen.